An Introduction to Constitutional Law, 100 plus Supreme Court Cases Everyone Should Know by Randy Barnett and Josh Blackman.
Korematsu versus United States, 1944.
December 7th, 1941, a day of infamy, even as Japanese diplomats were confirmed.
In the wake of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and after Congress's declaration of war against Japan, the Supreme Court would consider the legality of three executive actions taken by the Roosevelt administration. First, in Hirabayashi v. United States, 1943, the justices unanimously upheld a curfew imposed against American citizens of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast. Second, in Ex parte Endo, 1944, the court unanimously halted the military's detention of these Japanese Americans in detention camps. In the third case, Korematsu v. United States, 1944, the justices upheld the military's exclusion of Japanese Americans from certain zones on the West Coast. This 6-3 decision, which upheld Fred Korematsu's conviction, is ranked along with Dred Scott v. Sanford and Plessy v. Ferguson as among the most reviled Supreme Court opinions of all time. Justice Black's majority opinion in large measure defers to the arguments presented by the Roosevelt administration. We cannot say that the war-making branches of the government, Black noted, did not have ground for believing that in a critical hour such persons could not be readily isolated and separately dealt with. The court found that the racial classification survived what we now know as strict scrutiny. The exclusion from a threatened area, the court observed, has a definite and close relationship to the prevention of espionage and sabotage. In other words, the means were sufficiently tailored to accomplish the compelling state interest of protecting national security. At bottom, the majority was not willing to second-guess the military. We cannot, by availing ourselves of the calm perspective of hindsight, now say that at that time these actions were unjustified. There were three separate dissenting opinions. Justice Owen Roberts wrote that the indisputable facts exhibit a clear violation of constitutional rights. Excluded people could only challenge the order by breaking the law and refusing to leave their homes. This, Justice Roberts concluded, was a violation of the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. Justice Frank Murphy observed that this exclusion of all persons of Japanese ancestry goes over the very brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. Because no reliable evidence is cited to show that such individuals were generally disloyal, he wrote, the government did not satisfy the burden to justify this obvious racial discrimination. Study Guide. Does Justice Murphy rely on hindsight in his dissent? For this reason, Justice Murphy concluded that the exclusion of Japanese Americans deprives all those within its scope of the equal protection of the laws as guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment. Study Guide. Does the Fifth Amendment have an equal protection clause? Justice Jackson's dissent explained that a person's guilt was determined solely because he was born of different racial stock. Jackson was willing to second-guess the military commanders, especially when there was no evidence in the record to justify the policy, but still expressed a hesitancy in abandoning the presumption of constitutionality. Ultimately, he found that the use of racial categories in this manner violated the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. Korematsu was decided on December 18, 1944. However, the day before, the Western Defense Command lifted the exclusion order on the West Coast and allowed Japanese Americans to return to their homes. Though the notice was not published until 3 weeks later, there was some evidence that Chief Justice Stone, who was in touch with the executive branch, delayed the release of Korematsu and Endo, possibly to induce the administration to act. Study Guide. Was this case moot before it was even decided? In 1983, a federal court granted Fred Korematsu a writ of coram nobis, setting aside his conviction.
In the long history of our country's constant search for justice, Some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.
Convicted of violating the order, he waited more than 40 years for justice when a federal court overturned the judgment that the Supreme Court first upheld against him. A man of quiet bravery, Fred Korematsu deserves our respect and thanks for his patient pursuit to preserve the civil liberties we hold dear.
In 2011, the Solicitor General's office confessed error that it failed to disclose a report showing that, quote, only a small percentage of Japanese Americans pose a potential security threat. Korematsu is considered part of the so-called anti-canon. In 2018, the Supreme Court finally addressed this anti-canonical case in Trump versus Hawaii.
Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, has been overruled in the court of history, and, to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution.
Study Guide. What does Chief Justice Roberts mean by overruled in the court of history?